Hello, and welcome to my secondary subject and curriculum knowledge, learning and teaching and subject assignment. In this presentation, I will be analysing the impact my resource has had on a Key Stage 3 Year 9 Fine Art class. My resource was created for a mixed ability Key Stage 3 Year 9 class. The project we were working on is all about their own personal passions. The National Curriculum of 2014 says pupils should be taught to develop their creativity and ideas and increase proficiency in their execution. They should also be taught to use a range of techniques, media, including painting. The Personal Passions and Interest project is in preparation for transitioning to GCSE, allowing for large-scale work outside of A4 sketchbook spreads and building towards GCSE practice. The skills they are learning are exploration of their own ideas and articulation of their own interests, all aiming to build autonomy. In the project, they are encouraged to articulate self-interests and worldviews. To begin with, they were asked to brainstorm personal passions in their sketchbook and then pick an image from their research that they would like to paint onto a small canvas using acrylic. From knowing what the class had previously done in their art classes before now, I knew that they would have little to no knowledge of painting on a canvas, and that only basic knowledge of using the grid method to draw. Because of this, I knew I would need a strong resource that would allow me to scaffold their learning, enable for them to produce the best outcome possible. I wanted a resource that could be used for all aspects of the project. I thought this would be beneficial as it could be used from lesson 1 all the way to the end of the project. The most important thing for me after everything I'd learned so far from watching expert colleagues as well as all the theory days at university was that I knew I wanted to make my resource a really high quality example of what the students would be creating themselves. From what I'd learned of the Rosenshine principles, I knew that modelling and scaffolding the project was going to be extremely important for it to be successful. Rosenshine said the process of helping students solve difficult problems by modelling and providing scaffolds has been called cognitive apprenticeship. Students learn strategies and content during their apprenticeship that enables them to become competent readers, writers, and problem solvers. They are aided by a master who models, coaches, and provides support, and then scaffolds them to become independent. The idea for my canvas was for them to learn from watching my demonstration each week of different techniques they would need to be successful. This is to scaffold how they will go about painting their own canvases. It was also a good way for me to model the outcome I desired of them so that they knew the type of expectations I would have for them each week. Also, upon speaking to my mentor, we both felt it was important for me as a student teacher to try any work I set for the students. In the Ofsted report from 2008, it says the most effective teaching also draws on teachers' own creative experience as practitioners or from their own regular gallery visits. Teachers were able to empathise with students as learners because they rediscovered their thinking and practice as an artist, or because they had their passions for a particular artist's work reinvigorated. The most effective teachers drew on a breadth of personal experience and depth of subject knowledge to meet students' needs, even when the needs were complex. From this, I felt it showed the importance of art teachers' own practice as an artist, and how that as a student teacher who is still learning, it is extremely important for me to experience all types of art forms, especially those that I set students to do. As it says in the report, to empathise with students is crucial, as I found that by creating my resource alongside them, I was able to find out any difficulties they may have and how to teach them to overcome them. When creating my resource, I was also conscious of how I had learned about cognitive theory load. In applying Rosenshine to the secondary classroom article, N. Barker and various other authors write, cognitive theory load reveals that our working memory, used to process new information, is easily overburdened. Breaking down materials into small steps supports embedding material into long-term memory. The reason I created my resource as it is was so that I was able to break it down into these smaller steps to avoid overwhelming the students with information. I was able to use the canvas as one overall resource to model the final outcomes they needed to produce. But for the first few lessons of my planned sequence, I could use it as a continuing resource which built on top of each other. By using it for separate stepped demonstrations, I avoided overwhelming the students. Showing how to do everything in one go would be ineffective. Instead of, I was able to model what I wanted them to achieve each individual lesson. This image is the final product I produced over the lessons in which I used my canvas as a resource for my demonstrations. These images show, to a small extent, the process I went through during the lesson with the students. The first image shows how I used my resource for the beginning lessons of my sequence by showing the students exactly how I wanted them to grid their canvases and draw their images. The rest of the images I used to first show them the basics of using acrylic paint. I then, over further lessons, showed them how to build up their paint, add detail, and blend colours effectively. I was also able to use it to show them how to mix colours and colour match paints, as I found this task quite difficult. As I mentioned before, I was very conscious of how my resource fitted and was able to be used within my sequence of lessons, not just for one individual lesson. Hodge writes, "You need both long and medium-term planning so that you can teach each lesson with a clear understanding of where you are heading and when you intend to reach your goal." As I knew what the plan was for the overall topic and goal for the project, it was great that I was able to know what I would need to include in my shorter-term plans. Because of this, I was able to create a plan where I knew how I would use my resource to demonstrate the abilities the students would be learning, so that they were able to build a bank of knowledge on painting that they could continue to use during the project and going forward. As the project has a big emphasis on how art is done during GCSE, the students were essentially getting a small taste of the project that the Year 10s do for their mocks and the Year 11s do for their actual exam. I wanted to make sure that the foundations I taught them within my resource on how to paint on a canvas using acrylics was of high quality and would be something they can continue to use as a basis for learning even more going forward. When creating these plans for how I would use my resource, I wanted to make sure I kept thinking about cognitive theory, as I spoke about before. In Cognitive Load Theory article, it says cognitive load theory supports explicit models of instructions because such models tend to accord with how human brains learn most effectively. From this reading, I made sure I considered how I delivered my demonstrations, using my resource to make sure students were able to get the most from my instructions, and then use them not just for the one lesson but going forward as well. As I said before, I felt that the way I was using my resource over the sequence of lessons was a good way to scaffold the learning I wanted the students to achieve. Rosenshine says scaffolds include modelling the steps by teacher or thinking out loud by the teacher as he or she solves the problem. Scaffolds can also be tools such as cue cards or checklists that complete part of the task for the students, or a model of the completed task against which students can compare their own work. While I was achieving this by using the canvas itself to scaffold learning each week, adding new skills and demonstrating them repeatedly along with questioning to the students on their understanding, I was also able to create resources from my canvas. I used images I had taken of some of the steps I had shown them in person to create help sheets to prompt their memory of my demonstrations and help them when they were stuck. The lesson that my resource was originally intended for, and the most important lesson within the sequence, was the first lesson the students learned to use paint. The structure of the lesson is similar to how I conducted most of the lessons within the project, but I will explain this one in more detail so as to show how I effectively used my resource. We start our lesson by students coming into the class and settling into their seats ready for the register to be taken in silence. Before handing out their canvases or gathering them around the front table to do the demonstration, I like to do a recap of the previous lesson. In this case, the students had been gridding their canvases and drawing their images on them. I used questions to the students to get them to think about what we had done last lesson and to think about what expectations I had for them then and what I might have for this lesson. In the NSEAD article, it is written that teachers use questions to engage the students and sustain an active style of learning. The teacher also uses questions as part of the assessment of learning in order to determine how they best structure, organise and present new learning. Page 1, the taxonomy, explores the cognitive process. Asking questions develops cognitive thinking skills. This models and improves the development of ideas, imagination and creativity. Because of the reading I have done on this subject, as well as from observing other colleagues, I always make sure to use questioning within my teaching to make sure that students are understanding what I am teaching and are engaged. I then explain what we will be doing moving on in the lesson. I explain expectations and the purpose of the task, making sure students understood what I wanted them to achieve in the end by going over the learning objective. I also went over exactly how I will get out our paints and avoid accidents and messes. Asking students first how they think we should do it, then making sure I scaffold this part of learning as well so that in future classes they know what I expect of them when using paint. After this, I then move on to the demonstration of painting techniques using my canvas. I gather the class around the front table as this is a routine they're used to, and I find a good way for me to be able to show everybody my demonstration and engage the students in a more relaxed environment where they can learn from me and I can use questions easily to check for understanding. Hodge writes, "There is no better way to teach a technique or method of working than by demonstrating it to your students. By demonstrating a technique proficiently and explaining what you're doing logically and clearly as you work, you should engage everybody in the class." In this part of the lesson, I showed them how to use a paintbrush with acrylic, load it, as well as water down paint. I showed them about picking out a section of work to work on, working from the back to the front of the canvas, making sure backgrounds are done first. How to build layers of paint, starting with thin, ignoring details to begin with, and then building up on top of that layer, and then going over how to blend colours. I also reminded them of colour mixing that they should know the basics of from their Year 7 projects with the colour wheel and other projects they have done over the years as well. After this portion of the class, students move on to practical work of their own. On the tables they have a few help sheets made from my resource to help if they get stuck. I do this to help with the scaffolded learning I'm trying to get them to achieve. I hope that they can remember what I have taught them and then problem solve themselves, but if they can't remember, they are able to use these sheets to remind themselves with techniques and important tips I have told them. During this time, I made sure to include flight checks to keep students on task and encourage them in their work as well. I also checked on students individually. At the end of the lesson, I got the students to finish what they were doing and tidy away. During my lesson feedback given to me by my teaching mentor after he completed a lesson observation, he told me he was very happy with how I started the lesson with a recap of what we'd done previously. He also commented on how I had improved on my general classroom control and thought I had done a better job at gaining and keeping students' attention. He was very enthusiastic about my resource and demonstration, saying I had really engaged the students and that I had a good manner with them when I was doing the demonstration. He also praised how I was used questioning throughout the lesson, especially when using my resource. He was pleased with how I used flight checks during the class to keep students on track and motivated as well. The targets he set me during the feedback were more general than specific to the resource, but he thought that things that would help my overall classroom management and allow the class to go more smoothly would be paying closer attention to planning, as I didn't think through exactly how I was going to demonstrate some techniques, and I didn't have equipment to hand, so I had to delay the demonstration to ask a student to get it out for me. He also said that while I planned the getting out of paint well, I needed to plan the tidying up portion of the lesson better. The other targets he gave me were to help with behaviour management of the class. He said that I should learn more names which will help when I am doing questioning, as I can ask specific people without having to point or ask for hands up. He also said I should practice using a more sterner manner with the students, as when I am doing my demonstration, I had some people chatting and that I needed to make sure they understood that that was unacceptable. Fortunately, due to them unavoidably missing classes due to a snow day and Year 11 and 13 mock exams, meaning they were made to change rooms and unable to access paint, a lot of the students had not finished their paintings by the end of term. They will be getting the opportunity when they return after Christmas to finish them, but unfortunately I will not be there to do it with them. This is a selection of students' work from the class. Some is more finished than others depending on how challenging of a picture they chose to do. As you can see, there is a range of types of images. I found this challenging for both me and them, as I found that because they were all working on different types of things, it was hard to know exactly what to teach them, and they found it difficult as watching me paint a portrait was something quite different to painting an animal or a landscape. While I thought that my resource was used well and taken well by the students, and I am pleased with the outcomes they have produced, I do feel that reflection of both the lesson and the resource is important. Addison Burgess writes, "As a reflective teacher, you come to recognise the problematic nature of teaching art and design, and systematically reflect on your own practice in order to improve it. In doing so, you are simultaneously becoming engaged in teaching and learning, a relationship that echoes the quality of creative art activity in art, craft and design." I think upon reflection and the conversation I had with my mentor that I could have planned more on how I used my resource during the demonstration. Some of the techniques I showed weren't the best way to do things. I emphasised watering down paint to begin with, but wasn't clear that it needs to be built up a lot more than this, and that watery paint won't look good on its own. I could have planned more how I was going to explain blending as well, as I showed them, but I found it hard to explain what they should do with words. The other thing that I have reflected on since the lesson is how I could have adapted the resource more to be accessible. In Special Educational Needs in Mainstream School Guidance Report, it says if the teacher is supporting pupil with SEND, that scaffold may be in place for longer to promote confidence and competence that can be sustained once the scaffold is removed. I felt that as a demonstration using the resource was a lot of them watching me in the moment, showing them something. Students struggled to concentrate or remember what I would say. I think they may have benefited if I had recorded myself so they were able to watch it again. Like the report says, the scaffolding for SEND students may take longer, and in a video that I showed in the class, they were able to use it for as long as they need. To use this resource again, there are some things that I would change in order to make this resource more useful and beneficial to all. Firstly, I would do a landscape or still life painting, as that was a more commonly chosen theme. That would make the painting and demonstrations easier for students to relate to their own work. I would also be more forensic in how I planned what I was going to demonstrate. I would perhaps write down the techniques I was going to show and the definitions, not only to help myself when using the resource, but also to help students during the lesson to remember my demonstrations. Also, as I spoke about being more inclusive to SEND students, I would before class film myself doing the demonstration, which can then be watched more than once. Used by students who may have SEND needs as well, but also used as its own resource that can be used again for other future lessons. Lastly, I would use the process pictures I have taken of the exemplar canvas to create a resource board that can be used again once the actual painting is complete. This can show the process needed to complete for their project and can be used as an example for their final outcome. This could be used alongside the demonstrations to show what they will be working on in the lessons. I feel confident that by implementing these changes and extra additions, if I were to teach this class again, the resource in class would be greatly improved on and the students would gain even more high quality learning from the original one. Thank you for listening to my presentation.